The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete parking lot of Rosie's Diner, a greasy spoon restaurant that had served the military community of Camp Pendleton for over 30 years. Maria Santos adjusted the strap of her worn leather purse and checked her reflection in the side mirror of her beat-up Honda Civic. Dark circles under her brown eyes told the story of another sleepless night, another evening spent maintaining her carefully constructed cover identity. For 3 years, Maria had lived a double life that would have broken most people. By day, she was Maria Gonzalez, a struggling single mother working 2 minimum wage jobs to make ends meet. She cleaned office buildings from midnight to 6 in the morning, then served coffee and hash browns at Rosie's from 7 until 3 in the afternoon. Her hands were perpetually cracked from industrial cleaning chemicals. Her uniform always smelled like bacon grease, and her apartment was a cramped one-bedroom in the worst part of town. But Maria's real identity was something else entirely. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was one of only 18 women who had successfully completed Navy SEAL training, part of an experimental program that the Pentagon kept so classified that even most admirals didn't know existed. She was currently 3 months into the most important mission of her career, embedded deep within a human trafficking network that had been funneling victims through Southern California for over a decade. The mission had begun when naval intelligence discovered that someone within the military community was facilitating the movement of trafficked women and children through Camp Pendleton. The operation was sophisticated, using military vehicles and personnel to transport victims across state lines while hiding behind the legitimacy of official military business. Dozens of young women had simply vanished, their families left with nothing but unanswered questions and bureaucratic runaround. Maria's handler, Commander Sarah Chun, had handpicked her for the assignment based on her unique qualifications. Unlike many of her SEAL colleagues, Maria had grown up in poverty in East Los Angeles, the daughter of undocumented immigrants who had worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. She understood the desperation that made vulnerable people easy targets for predators. More importantly, she could blend seamlessly into the working-class community where the trafficking network recruited its victims. The transformation had been brutal. Maria had to gain 40 pounds, deliberately damaging her physical conditioning to match her cover identity. She learned to walk differently, to speak with the accent and mannerisms of someone who had never received proper education. Most difficult of all, she had to suppress every instinct that had been drilled into her during years of elite military training. When men talked down to her or treated her dismissively, she had to smile and take it instead of responding with the lethal force she was capable of delivering. 3 months into the mission, Maria had made significant progress infiltrating the network. She had identified several key players, including a Marine sergeant named Buck Morrison, who seemed to be one of the primary recruiters. Morrison frequented Rosie's Diner, where he would identify vulnerable young women and gradually gain their trust before offering them opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Jobs with good pay, transportation to other cities, promises of a better life that always ended the same way. Maria had positioned herself perfectly to observe Morrison's activities. As a waitress, she was practically invisible to him and his associates. They talked freely in front of her, treating her like a piece of furniture that happened to pour coffee. She had recorded dozens of hours of conversations using a device hidden in her uniform, slowly building a case that would bring down the entire network. But the constant stress of maintaining her cover was taking its toll. Maria hadn't been able to contact her family in months, hadn't been able to exercise properly, hadn't been able to be herself for even a moment. She woke up every morning feeling like she was suffocating in someone else's skin, counting down the days until she could return to her real life. On this particular morning, Maria was running late for her shift at Rosie's. Her ancient Honda had refused to start, and she'd had to take 2 buses to get to work. The restaurant was already busy with the breakfast crowd when she arrived, mostly Marines from the base grabbing quick meals before their shift began. The familiar sounds of sizzling bacon and shouted orders filled the air as Maria tied her apron around her waist and grabbed her order pad. The morning passed in its usual blur of coffee refills and breakfast orders. Maria moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her trained eye constantly scanning for anything unusual while maintaining the facade of a tired, overworked waitress. Around 10:30, the breakfast rush began to wind down, leaving only a few lingering customers scattered throughout the restaurant. That's when she noticed the young woman sitting alone in the corner booth. The girl couldn't have been more than 19, with the kind of desperate, hollow look that Maria had learned to recognize. She was pretty in a vulnerable way, with long dark hair and clothes that were clean but clearly secondhand. More telling was the way she kept glancing toward the door, as if she was waiting for someone, but wasn't entirely sure she wanted them to show up. Maria approached the table with a fresh pot of coffee and her best customer service smile. The girl ordered nothing but black coffee and toast, paying with crumpled bills that she counted twice before handing over. Everything about her screamed of someone who was barely getting by, exactly the kind of target that Morrison and his network preferred. 20 minutes later, Maria's instincts proved correct. Buck Morrison walked through the front door of Rosie's Diner like he owned the place. Morrison was everything that was wrong with military culture distilled into one person. He was a big man, 6'4", and thick through the shoulders, with the kind of cocky swagger that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing suggested someone who expected the world to get out of his way. Maria had been watching Morrison for months, documenting his patterns and behaviors. He had a specific approach that he used with potential victims. First, he would position himself where they could see him but not feel threatened. Then, he would make casual conversation, usually starting with some comment about the food or the weather. He was charming in a practiced way, with just enough rough edges to seem authentic. Most importantly, he had an ability to identify exactly what each woman needed to hear, whether it was validation, financial security, or simply someone who seemed to care about their problems. Morrison spotted the young woman in the corner booth immediately. Maria watched from behind the counter as his eyes locked onto his target, a predatory smile crossing his face. He ordered coffee and a Danish, then made his way to a table that gave him a clear line of sight to the girl while appearing to mind his own business. For the next hour, Maria watched Morrison work his magic. He started with meaningful glances and a friendly nod when the girl looked his way. Then, he made a casual comment about the quality of the coffee when Maria came to refill his cup, speaking just loudly enough for the girl to hear. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to draw her into conversation. The girl, who introduced herself as Amy, was exactly the kind of victim that Morrison specialized in recruiting. She was new to the area, having moved to California from a small town in Iowa after aging out of the foster care system. She had no family, no support network, and was working as a hotel housekeeper for minimum wage while living in a weekly rate motel. She was lonely, broke, and desperately hoping for something better. Morrison listened to her story with practiced sympathy, offering just enough details about his own fictional background to seem trustworthy. He claimed to work in logistics for a private security company, traveling frequently and earning good money. He had contacts throughout the Southwest who were always looking for reliable people, especially attractive young women who could work as receptionists or administrative assistants for high-end businesses. Maria felt sick watching the performance, knowing exactly where it would lead. Morrison was a master manipulator, able to read people's vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. He never made promises that sounded too good to be true, never pushed too hard or too fast. Instead, he planted seeds of possibility and let his victims convince themselves that he was their ticket to a better life. As the conversation continued, Maria began taking pictures with a hidden camera in her uniform. Every interaction between Morrison and potential victims was valuable evidence, but she needed to be careful not to blow her cover. She moved around the restaurant, performing her normal duties, refilling coffee cups, and clearing tables while keeping one ear on the conversation in the corner. Around noon, Morrison made his move. He pulled out his phone and showed Amy some photos, supposedly of the offices where she might be able to work. The pictures showed clean, professional environments with well-dressed people, exactly the kind of workplace that someone like Amy could only dream of accessing. Morrison explained that his company was expanding into new markets and needed local representatives who could handle client relations. The job, as Morrison described it, sounded perfect. Good pay, flexible hours, opportunities for advancement, and even assistance with housing for the right candidate. All Amy needed to do was be willing to travel occasionally, maybe spend a few weeks training at facilities in other states. The company would handle all the arrangements and expenses, of course. Maria had heard variations of this pitch dozens of times over the past 3 months. Morrison was particularly skilled at making the trafficking operation sound like a legitimate business opportunity. The women he recruited genuinely believed they were taking jobs in customer service or hospitality until it was too late to escape. Amy was clearly interested but still cautious. She asked reasonable questions about the company, the specific job duties, and the training requirements. Morrison had answers for everything, along with business cards and brochures that looked completely professional. He even offered to let her speak with other women who had gone through the program, though Maria knew those references would either be fake or coerced. As the lunch rush began to pick up, Morrison suggested that he and Amy continue their conversation somewhere more private. He recommended a coffee shop across town where they could discuss the details of the opportunity without distractions. Amy hesitated for a moment, her survival instincts warring with her desperation for a better life. Maria watched the internal struggle play out across the young woman's face and felt a familiar surge of rage. This was the moment she hated most about undercover work, watching predators manipulate vulnerable people while being unable to intervene directly. Every fiber of her SEAL training screamed at her to act, to protect the innocent and eliminate the threat. But blowing her cover now would mean losing the chance to bring down the entire network and save hundreds of future victims. Morrison sensed Amy's hesitation and backed off slightly, demonstrating the patience that made him so effective. He suggested that she take some time to think about the opportunity, giving her his business card and promising to follow up in a few days. This approach was deliberately designed to make Amy feel like she was in control of the decision while actually increasing her psychological investment in the opportunity. As Morrison prepared to leave, he made one final move that demonstrated his predatory nature. He quietly asked Maria for the check, but instead of simply paying for his meal, he made a point of leaving an unusually large tip, $20 on a $6 check, placed conspicuously on the table where Amy could see it. The gesture was calculated to reinforce Morrison's image as someone with money and generosity, but Maria recognized it for what it really was. Morrison was showing off for Amy while also asserting his dominance over what he perceived as a lowly waitress. To him, Maria was just another minimum wage worker who should be grateful for his largesse. As Morrison stood to leave, he made eye contact with Maria and gave her a patronizing smile. The look in his eyes was one of casual dismissal, the expression of someone who viewed service workers as fundamentally inferior beings who existed solely for his convenience. He had no idea that the woman he was looking down on was one of the most highly trained killers in the United States military. Maria maintained her customer service smile and thanked him for his generosity, playing her role perfectly. But inside, she was making mental notes about everything she had observed. Morrison's recruitment technique, his approach to building trust with victims, the specific promises he made, and the timeline he followed were all valuable intelligence that would eventually help bring him to justice. After Morrison left, Amy remained at her table for another 20 minutes, staring at his business card and clearly wrestling with her decision. Maria wanted desperately to warn her, to find some way to protect her without compromising the larger mission. But there was nothing she could do except watch and wait, hoping that Amy would listen to whatever instincts were telling her to be cautious. Eventually, Amy gathered her courage and approached the counter where Maria was working. She seemed nervous but determined, clutching Morrison's business card in her hand like a lifeline. "Excuse me," Amy said quietly, "but did you happen to overhear any of my conversation with that Marine?" Maria looked up from the coffee pot she was cleaning, her heart racing. This was dangerous territory. Any response that seemed too informed could raise suspicions. But Amy's question also presented an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt without being obvious about it. I try not to listen to customers' private conversations, Maria replied carefully, but I couldn't help noticing he seemed pretty interested in talking to you. You seemed a little nervous about something. Amy nodded, her uncertainty evident. He offered me a job opportunity, but something about it felt, I don't know, maybe too good to be true. Do you know anything about him? He comes in here sometimes, right? This was exactly the opening Maria had hoped for. She could provide just enough information to make Amy more cautious without revealing anything that would compromise her cover or the investigation. He's been coming in here for a few months, Maria said, keeping her voice casual while she continued cleaning. Always very charming, always tips well. I've seen him talking to a lot of young women, usually about job opportunities or business ventures. Some of them seemed really excited about whatever he was offering. Have you seen any of them again? Amy asked, and Maria could hear the concern growing in her voice. Maria paused for a moment, as if thinking back through her memories. You know, now that you mention it, I don't think I have. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything bad, right? Maybe they all got great jobs and moved away. The doubt in Maria's voice was carefully calculated. She wasn't making any direct accusations against Morrison, but she was giving Amy permission to trust her own instincts about the situation. Sometimes the most effective way to protect someone was to help them protect themselves. Amy spent a few more minutes asking casual questions about Morrison's previous visits, and Maria provided just enough information to reinforce her concerns without being obvious about it. She mentioned that Morrison seemed to have a preference for talking to women who appeared to be new to the area or going through difficult times. She noted that he always seemed to have business cards and professional-looking materials with him, as if he was constantly recruiting for something. By the time Amy left Rosie's diner, Maria could see that the seeds of doubt had been planted. Amy still had Morrison's business card, but her body language suggested that she was having serious second thoughts about the opportunity he had presented. With luck, she would listen to her instincts and find another way to improve her situation. As Maria watched Amy walk away, she felt a mixture of relief and frustration. She had potentially saved one victim without compromising her mission, but Morrison would undoubtedly find another target within days. The trafficking network he worked for had an endless appetite for vulnerable women, and there was never a shortage of people desperate enough to fall for their lies. The rest of Maria's shift passed without incident, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building toward confrontation. Morrison had been more active recently, recruiting more aggressively and taking greater risks. Intelligence suggested that the network was planning something big, possibly a major shipment of victims to facilities outside the country. Maria's mission was entering its most critical phase, and she knew that maintaining her cover would become increasingly difficult as the investigation moved toward its conclusion. She had gathered enough evidence to identify most of the network's key players, but she still needed to locate their primary staging facility and document the leadership structure that made the entire operation possible. As she finished cleaning tables and restocking supplies at the end of her shift, Maria allowed herself a moment to think about her real life waiting beyond this assignment. In a few more weeks, she would be able to return to her SEAL team, to the identity and community where she truly belonged. She would trade her grease-stained uniform for military fatigues, her minimum wage exhaustion for the focused intensity of special operations. But first, she had to see this mission through to its conclusion. Too many lives hung in the balance. Too many young women like Amy were depending on her success. Maria had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and that oath extended far beyond conventional military operations. She locked up Rosie's diner and walked to her beat-up Honda, mentally preparing for another night of maintaining her cover identity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to gather intelligence, and new tests of her ability to remain invisible in plain sight. As she drove through the evening traffic toward her cramped apartment, Maria Santos reminded herself that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she had been trained to do. The mission was everything, and personal comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford until the job was done. She had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, everything would change in a way that would force her to choose between maintaining her cover and defending her own honor. The confrontation that would define the rest of her mission was already set in motion, though she wouldn't recognize it until the moment Buck Morrison made the biggest mistake of his military career. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would accelerate everything Maria had been working toward. She arrived at Rosie's diner to find Commander Sarah Chun waiting in the parking lot, disguised as a middle-aged insurance adjuster named Barbara Mills. Chin's presence meant either very good news or very bad news, and, given the expression on her handler's face, Maria suspected it wasn't good. They met in Chin's rental car, a deliberately unremarkable sedan parked behind the dumpsters where they couldn't be observed from the restaurant. Chun activated a small electronic device that would scramble any potential listening devices before speaking in the clipped, professional tone that Maria had learned to associate with mission-critical updates. "We have a problem," Chun began without preamble. Naval intelligence intercepted communications suggesting that Morrison's network is planning to move a large shipment of victims within the next 72 hours. At least 20 women, possibly more, being transported to facilities in Mexico where they'll disappear permanently. Maria felt her stomach clench. 20 victims represented months of recruiting efforts by Morrison and his associates. These weren't just statistics in a case file. They were real people with families and dreams who had been manipulated into trusting the wrong person at the most vulnerable moments of their lives. "Do we know the departure point?" Maria asked, her mind already racing through the tactical possibilities. "That's where you come in," Chin replied. "We believe Morrison is using the diner as a final meeting point before transport. Our sources suggest he'll be bringing several recruits there tomorrow morning, supposedly for job interviews with his fictional security company. What they don't know is that they'll be loaded into vehicles and taken directly to a staging facility near the Mexican border." The implications were staggering. Maria had been watching Morrison recruit victims one at a time over the past 3 months, but she had never imagined that Rosie's Diner was being used as a collection point for mass trafficking operations. The restaurant's location made perfect sense from an operational perspective, close enough to Camp Pendleton to provide military cover while remaining far enough from the main base to avoid scrutiny. "What's my role?" Maria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You need to identify as many victims as possible and document everything you can about the operation," Chin explained. "Vehicle descriptions, personnel involved, timing, routes, anything that will help us track them after they leave the diner. But under no circumstances are you to blow your cover or attempt to intervene directly. We'll have surveillance teams positioned around the area, but they won't move until the victims are being transported." Maria nodded, understanding the logic even as every instinct rebelled against it. Allowing 20 innocent women to be loaded into vehicles and driven toward Mexico went against everything she believed in as a SEAL and as a human being. But stopping the transport prematurely would only save these specific victims while allowing the network to continue operating and claiming hundreds more. "There's something else," Chun continued, her expression growing even more serious. "Intelligence suggests that Morrison suspects he's being watched. Nothing specific, but he's been more cautious lately, changing his patterns and varying his routes. We can't afford any additional suspicion falling on our operation." This was the news Maria had been dreading. Undercover operations always walked a knife's edge between gathering intelligence and maintaining credibility. If Morrison was already suspicious, any unusual behavior from Maria could trigger his paranoia and potentially expose the entire mission. They spent another 20 minutes reviewing contingency plans and communication protocols before Chun disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. Maria entered Rosie's Diner and began her shift, hyper-aware that everything she did over the next 48 hours could determine the success or failure of a 3-year investigation. The morning passed normally, with the usual collection of Marines, construction workers, and local residents grabbing breakfast before starting their days. Maria performed her duties with practiced efficiency while scanning every face and listening to every conversation, searching for any sign that Morrison's operation was moving into its final phase. Around mid-morning, she noticed an unusual number of young women entering the restaurant alone. They were all roughly the same age and demographic as Morrison's typical targets, and They all had the same lost, hopeful expression that Maria had learned to recognize. More telling was their behavior once inside the restaurant. Instead of ordering meals and leaving, they lingered over coffee, checking their phones constantly and glancing toward the door as if waiting for someone specific. By 11 o'clock, Maria had counted 7 young women scattered throughout the restaurant, all exhibiting the same nervous anticipation. She recognized 2 of them from previous interactions with Morrison, but the others were new faces who had presumably been recruited through other channels. The realization that Morrison had multiple recruitment pipelines operating simultaneously was both impressive and terrifying from an operational perspective. Maria began taking discreet photographs with her hidden camera while performing her normal duties. Each woman represented crucial evidence in the case against Morrison's network, but more importantly, each face would help identify victims once the rescue operation began. She memorized clothing descriptions, physical characteristics, and behavioral patterns that might help track them if they were separated during transport. At exactly 11:30, Morrison entered Rosie's diner with 2 other Marines that Maria had never seen before. Both men were large and intimidating, with the kind of military bearing that suggested special forces or security backgrounds. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their haircuts, posture, and the way they automatically surveyed the restaurant upon entering marked them clearly as military personnel. Morrison moved through the restaurant with confident familiarity, stopping at each table where one of his recruits was waiting. He spoke quietly to each woman, his manner professional and reassuring as he explained the next steps in their supposed job application process. To any casual observer, it would have looked like a legitimate business meeting between an employer and potential employees. Maria watched the interaction with growing alarm as she realized the scope of what she was witnessing. This wasn't just another recruitment meeting, it was the final assembly phase of a major trafficking operation. Morrison was collecting women he had been cultivating for weeks or months, bringing them together for what they believed would be job interviews, but would actually be their last moments of freedom. The 2 Marines accompanying Morrison positioned themselves strategically around the restaurant, one near the front entrance and one near the rear exit. Their presence wasn't obviously threatening, but Maria's tactical training recognized them immediately as containment positions. Anyone trying to leave unexpectedly would have to get past at least one of them. As Morrison continued his rounds, Maria began to piece together the full scope of the operation. The women had been told to arrive at staggered times and wait for further instructions. Morrison was now collecting them in groups, supposedly to carpool to the interview location. But Maria knew that once they left Rosie's diner, these women would never be seen again by their families or friends. One of the recruits was Amy, the young woman Maria had spoken with the day before. Despite Maria's attempts to plant seeds of doubt, Amy had obviously decided to trust Morrison's promises of employment and a better future. She sat alone in a corner booth, dressed in her best clothes and clutching a folder that presumably contained her resume and other personal documents. Maria felt a surge of protective anger as she watched Amy's hopeful expression. The young woman had no family, no support network, and no one who would immediately report her missing if she disappeared. Morrison had specifically targeted her vulnerability, exploiting her desperation with promises he had no intention of keeping. Around noon, Morrison began organizing his recruits into departure groups. He explained that they would be traveling to interview locations in 3 separate vehicles, with each group meeting with different department heads of his fictional security company. The women were told to leave their personal belongings at the diner for safekeeping, taking only their identification documents and interview materials. This detail sent chills down Maria's spine. Forcing the victims to abandon their personal belongings was a classic trafficking technique designed to eliminate any items that might help authorities identify or track them later. Once they left Rosie's diner, these women would have nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever identification Morrison chose to let them keep. The first group of victims was assembled near the front entrance, with Morrison personally escorting them toward the parking lot. Maria managed to photograph the license plates of the vehicles through the restaurant's front window, committing the numbers to memory as backup in case her hidden camera malfunctioned. As the second group prepared to leave, Amy approached the counter where Maria was working. She seemed nervous but excited, clearly believing that she was about to embark on a new chapter of her life that would lift her out of poverty and desperation. "I wanted to thank you for our conversation yesterday," Amy said quietly. "It really helped me think through this opportunity. I decided that sometimes you have to take risks if you want things to change, you know?" Maria's heart broke as she realized that her attempt to warn Amy had actually backfired. Instead of discouraging her from trusting Morrison, their conversation had somehow convinced Amy that she was making a carefully considered decision rather than falling for a predator's manipulation. "I hope everything works out for you," Maria replied, her voice carefully neutral despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Good luck with your interview." Amy smiled and rejoined her group, chatting nervously with the other women as they prepared to leave. Maria watched through the window as they climbed into a black SUV with tinted windows, Morrison personally ensuring that each woman was seated before closing the doors. The vehicle pulled away from the restaurant and disappeared into traffic, carrying its unsuspecting cargo toward an uncertain fate. The third group was smaller, consisting of only 3 women who looked even younger than the previous recruits. Maria estimated that at least one of them was probably still a teenager, though she carried herself with the premature maturity that often came from aging out of the foster care system. As this final group prepared to leave, one of Morrison's associates approached Maria at the counter. He was the larger of the 2 Marines, a man with cold eyes and the kind of smile that never reached his face. Everything about his demeanor suggested someone who enjoyed having power over vulnerable people. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying a tone of casual condescension. "We're going to need you to forget about everything you saw here today. Understand?" The threat was delivered with practiced smoothness, designed to sound almost friendly while making its meaning perfectly clear. Maria understood that this was standard procedure for Morrison's operation, ensuring that potential witnesses were properly intimidated before the trafficking victims were transported. "I don't know what you mean," Maria replied, playing her role as a confused minimum-wage worker. "I'm just here to serve coffee and take orders." The Marine's smile grew wider, but his eyes remained completely cold. "That's exactly the right attitude, sweetheart. Keep serving coffee and minding your own business, and you won't have any problems. But if you start thinking you saw something interesting, or if you get any ideas about talking to people you shouldn't be talking to, well, that would be a real shame." Maria nodded nervously, maintaining her cover identity even as she memorized every detail of the man's appearance for later identification. His threat was actually valuable evidence of the network's operational security measures, proof that they were aware their activities required witness intimidation. After the final group departed, Rosie's diner felt eerily quiet. Maria went through the motions of cleaning tables and restocking supplies, but her mind was focused entirely on the 20 women who had just driven away to their doom. She had documented everything she could without compromising her cover, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she should have done more. The afternoon shift brought a return to normal operations, with regular customers replacing the trafficking victims who had filled the restaurant that morning. Maria served coffee and took orders while internally reviewing everything she had observed, organizing details that would be crucial for the rescue operation she knew was already being planned. Around 3 o'clock, as Maria was preparing to end her shift, Morrison returned to the restaurant alone. His demeanor was relaxed and satisfied, the expression of someone who had just completed a successful business transaction. He ordered coffee and pie, settling into a booth near the window where he could observe the parking lot. Maria approached his table with practiced subservience, pouring coffee and asking if he needed anything else. Morrison looked up at her with the same dismissive expression she had seen so many times before, but there was something different in his eyes, a calculating quality that suggested he was evaluating her more carefully than usual. "You've been working here a while," Morrison observed, his tone conversational but with an underlying edge. "Must see a lot of interesting people come and go." "Not really," Maria replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Most customers are just here for the food. I don't pay much attention to anything else." Morrison nodded slowly, but Maria could see that he was studying her reaction carefully. His suspicion was clearly focused on her now, though she couldn't determine what specifically had triggered his attention. She maintained her cover identity perfectly, but Morrison's paranoia was making him scrutinize everyone around him. "That's probably smart," Morrison said after a moment. "Sometimes people who pay too much attention to things that don't concern them end up getting hurt. Real shame when that happens." The warning was clear, but Maria couldn't tell if Morrison suspected her specifically or was simply being cautious about all potential witnesses. Either way, she needed to be extremely careful about her behavior going forward. Any mistake now could not only blow her cover, but potentially endanger the rescue operation that was undoubtedly already in motion. Morrison finished his coffee and left a generous tip, but his departure felt more like a temporary withdrawal than a genuine exit. Maria had the distinct impression that she was now under active observation by Morrison and his associates. Her 3 months of careful undercover work had brought her to the edge of exposure just as the mission reached its most critical phase. As she finished her shift and prepared to leave Rosie's diner, Maria's secure phone vibrated with an encrypted message from Commander Chun. The text was brief, but loaded with significance. "Package delivered. Tracking in progress. Maintain position and await instructions." The message confirmed that naval intelligence was already tracking the vehicles carrying Morrison's victims. Surveillance teams were following the transport convoy, while additional units moved into position around the staging facility where the women would be processed before being moved across the border. Maria drove home to her cramped apartment, knowing that the next 24 hours would determine whether 3 years of undercover work would result in the destruction of a major trafficking network or the loss of 20 innocent lives. She had done everything possible to gather intelligence while maintaining her cover, but the success of the rescue operation now depended on factors beyond her control. That evening, as she sat in her tiny kitchen eating a microwave dinner, Maria allowed herself to think about the women who had trusted Morrison's promises that morning. Amy and the others were probably being held in some warehouse or safe house, still believing they were participating in an elaborate job interview process. They had no idea that their freedom had already been stolen, that they were being prepared for a life of exploitation and abuse. The weight of their situation pressed down on Maria like a physical force. Every minute that passed brought them closer to being transported across the border, where rescue would become exponentially more difficult. She had given naval intelligence everything they needed to locate and identify the victims, but bureaucratic delays or tactical complications could still result in failure. Maria's secure phone remained silent through the evening, providing no updates on the rescue operation's progress. She understood operational security requirements, but the lack of information was torture for someone who had invested so much in the mission's success. She had sacrificed her own identity for 3 months, living as someone else while watching predators manipulate vulnerable people. As she prepared for bed, Maria checked her equipment one final time and reviewed her contingency plans. Tomorrow would bring either vindication for her sacrifices or devastating failure that would haunt her for the rest of her career. Either way, she knew that her undercover phase was nearly over. She had no way of knowing that Morrison's growing suspicion would soon force a confrontation that would test every aspect of her training and force her to choose between maintaining her cover and defending her own dignity. The moment that would define her entire mission was less than 18 hours away, though she wouldn't recognize it until Buck Morrison made the mistake that would change everything. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Maria's secure phone buzzed at 4:30 in the morning with an encrypted message that made her blood run cold. Rescue operation compromised. Subjects relocated. Maintain cover at all costs. New intelligence critical. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the message as its implications sank in. Somehow, Morrison's network had detected the surveillance operation and moved their victims to a secondary location. 20 innocent women were now lost in a system designed to make them disappear completely, and Maria's 3 months of undercover work had failed to prevent their exploitation. The secondary message that followed provided additional details that were even more disturbing. Intelligence suggested that the trafficking network had been tipped off by someone with access to military communications. There was a mole inside the operation, someone who had warned Morrison that his activities were being monitored. This explained his recent paranoia and increased security measures, Maria realized that her mission had suddenly become far more dangerous. If Morrison knew he was under investigation, he would be actively looking for evidence of surveillance and infiltration. Her cover identity, which had seemed secure just 24 hours earlier, was now potentially compromised. Every interaction from this point forward could expose her as a federal agent embedded within his operation. She dressed quickly and drove to Rosie's diner, arriving earlier than usual to observe the parking lot and surrounding area for signs of increased security. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but Maria's trained eye detected subtle changes that suggested Morrison's organization was adapting to the threat they now knew they faced. The morning rush proceeded without incident, but Maria noticed that several of Morrison's usual associates were absent from their regular breakfast routines. The trafficking network was clearly reducing its profile while they assessed the scope of the law enforcement interest in their activities. This was both good news and bad news for Maria's mission. Lower visibility made her safer from detection, but it also reduced opportunities to gather the intelligence needed to locate the missing victims. Around 10 o'clock, Maria received an unexpected visitor that complicated everything. Amy walked through the front door of Rosie's diner, alive and apparently unharmed, but clearly shaken by whatever experience she had endured over the past 24 hours. Her presence meant that at least one victim had escaped Morrison's operation, but it also represented a significant security risk for Maria's continued cover. Amy approached the counter where Maria was working, her movements nervous and uncertain. She kept glancing toward the door as if she expected to be followed, and her clothes were wrinkled and dirty as if she had spent the night sleeping rough. "I need to talk to someone," Amy said quietly, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Something terrible is happening, and I don't know who to trust." Maria's heart raced as she realized the position she was now in. Amy represented a potential intelligence breakthrough that could lead to locating the other victims, but talking to her openly could expose Maria's true identity if Morrison had any surveillance on the restaurant. She needed to find a way to extract information while maintaining her cover and protecting both of their safety. "What's wrong?" Maria asked, keeping her voice at the level of concerned customer service rather than professional interrogation. "You look like you haven't slept." Amy's story came out in fragments, interrupted by nervous glances and long pauses as she struggled to process what had happened to her. The supposed job interview had turned into a nightmare when she and the other women were driven to a warehouse facility outside the city limits. Instead of meeting with human resources personnel, they had been locked in a room with no windows and told to wait for processing. The facade of legitimate employment had completely disappeared once they arrived at the facility. Armed guards had confiscated their identification documents and personal belongings, claiming that everything needed to be secured for safety reasons. The women had been given uniforms to change into and told that they would be transported to their final work assignment within hours. Amy had realized something was terribly wrong when she overheard guards discussing which women would be sent to facilities in Mexico and which would remain in domestic operations. The conversation had made it clear that none of them would be working in customer service or administrative positions as Morrison had promised. "I managed to get away when they were moving us to different rooms," Amy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a moment when the guards were distracted, and I slipped out through a loading dock. I've been hiding in an abandoned building all night, trying to figure out what to do." Maria felt a surge of relief that Amy had escaped, but she also recognized the immediate danger the young woman now faced. Morrison's organization would be actively searching for her, and her presence at Rosie's diner could compromise both of their safety. More importantly, Amy's escape might prompt the traffickers to accelerate their timeline for moving the remaining victims. "Have you contacted the police?" Maria asked, though she already knew what the answer would be. Amy shook her head, her expression filled with fear and confusion. "I don't have any proof of what happened, and some of the guards were wearing military uniforms. I'm afraid that if I go to the wrong people, they'll just send me back to Morrison. I don't know who's involved in this thing or how high up it goes." Her paranoia was entirely justified, given that Morrison's network had infiltrators within military and law enforcement agencies. Amy's instinct to be cautious about who she trusted had probably saved her life, but it also complicated any potential rescue operation for the remaining victims. Maria needed to find a way to extract tactical intelligence from Amy without revealing her own identity or putting either of them at greater risk. She couldn't use standard interrogation techniques that would mark her as a trained professional, but she also couldn't waste the opportunity to gather information that might lead to rescuing the other women. "Do you remember anything about the location where they took you?" Maria asked, framing the question as natural curiosity rather than professional interest. Maybe something that could help the authorities find the other women. Amy provided a detailed description of the route they had taken from Rosie's diner to the warehouse facility, including landmarks and distinctive buildings she had observed through the vehicle's windows. Her account suggested that the staging facility was located in an industrial area approximately 30 minutes southeast of the restaurant, in a region that provided easy access to highways leading toward the Mexican border. More importantly, Amy had overheard conversations suggesting that the facility was only a temporary holding point. The traffickers were planning to move their victims to a more secure location within the next few hours, possibly across state lines where federal jurisdiction would complicate any rescue efforts. As Amy continued her account, Maria began to realize that she was facing an impossible choice. The information Amy had provided was crucial for locating the missing victims, but transmitting it to naval intelligence would require actions that could expose her cover identity. Using her secure communication device or meeting with her handler would create evidence that Morrison's organization could potentially detect. At the same time, failing to act on Amy's intelligence could result in 20 women disappearing permanently into the international trafficking network. Every hour that passed brought them closer to being transported beyond the reach of American law enforcement agencies. Maria's internal conflict was interrupted by the arrival of Morrison's associate, the large Marine who had threatened her the previous day. He entered Rosie's diner with the casual confidence of someone conducting routine business, but his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the restaurant. Several regular customers seemed to sense the underlying tension and quickly finished their meals before leaving. The Marine positioned himself at a table with a clear view of both the front entrance and the counter where Maria was working. His arrival was clearly not a coincidence, given that Amy had just escaped from his organization's facility. Either he was conducting surveillance to see who might approach Maria with information, or he suspected that Amy might return to the restaurant where she had first met Morrison. Amy noticed the Marine's presence immediately, her face going pale as she recognized him from the warehouse facility. She had the good sense not to react, obviously, but Maria could see the panic building in her eyes as she realized she might have walked into a trap. "I need to use the restroom," Amy said quietly, her voice tight with controlled fear. Maria nodded and gestured toward the back of the restaurant, but she knew that Amy was actually looking for an escape route. The rear exit would take her into an alley that connected to several side streets, providing multiple options for evading pursuit if the Marine decided to follow her. As Amy moved toward the restrooms, the Marine's attention shifted to track her movement. Maria realized that she was about to witness a confrontation that could escalate quickly and expose both of their identities. She needed to find a way to defuse the situation without revealing her own training or capabilities. The Marine rose from his table and began walking toward the rear of the restaurant, his movement casual but purposeful. Maria knew that once Amy was cornered in the restroom area, she would have no escape options and would likely be forced to accompany him back to Morrison's facility. Acting on instinct, Maria deliberately knocked over a full coffee pot, sending hot liquid and broken ceramic across the floor behind the counter. The crash and her subsequent exclamation of frustration drew the attention of everyone in the restaurant, including the Marine who turned to see what had happened. "I'm so sorry," Maria called out loudly, making a show of being flustered by the accident. "Could someone help me clean this up? I don't want anyone to slip on the wet floor." The distraction gave Amy the opportunity she needed to slip out the rear exit without being observed. The Marine realized what had happened, but by the time he reached the back door, Amy had already disappeared into the maze of alleys and side streets surrounding the restaurant. When a Marine returned to the dining area, his expression was thunderous. He approached Maria's position behind the counter, his entire demeanor radiating barely controlled aggression. She could see that he suspected her of deliberately interfering with his pursuit of Amy, but he couldn't prove it without revealing more about his own activities than he was willing to admit. "Clumsy accident," he said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he didn't believe it was an accident at all. "I'm really sorry about the noise," Maria replied, maintaining her cover identity as a nervous, minimum-wage worker. "I'm not usually so careless, but I guess I'm having an off day." The Marine studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or hidden competence. Maria forced herself to appear genuinely flustered and apologetic, even as every instinct screamed at her to prepare for combat. This man was clearly dangerous, and his growing suspicion made him an immediate threat to her safety. "You seem to have a lot of interesting customers," the Marine observed, his tone deceptively casual. "Young women with problems, always looking for help with their situations." "I just serve coffee," Maria replied. "I try not to get involved in customers' personal business." But the Marine wasn't buying her act anymore. Something in his expression had shifted, and Maria realized that her cover might already be blown. Morrison's organization had been compromised by federal law enforcement, and they would naturally be looking for signs of infiltration within their operational area. "You know," the Marine continued, moving closer to the counter, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about minding your own business and not seeing things that don't concern you. But here's the thing about that advice. Sometimes people think they're being smart by playing dumb, when really they're just making themselves more suspicious." Maria felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the shift in his demeanor. This was no longer casual intimidation designed to silence a potential witness. This was active interrogation by someone who suspected her of being more than she appeared to be. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and Maria knew that she was approaching a point where maintaining her cover might become impossible. If Morrison's associate escalated his suspicions into direct action, she would be forced to defend herself in ways that would expose her true identity and training. At the same time, Amy's escape meant that crucial intelligence about the trafficking operation's current location was now in the hands of someone who could potentially contact law enforcement. If Maria could somehow transmit Amy's information to naval intelligence without compromising her position, there might still be a chance to rescue the remaining victims. The Marine leaned against the counter, his bulk and proximity clearly designed to be intimidating. "I think you and I need to have a more detailed conversation about what you've been seeing around here lately. Maybe somewhere more private where we won't be interrupted." His suggestion was clearly a threat rather than a request. Maria realized that she was being actively recruited for interrogation by Morrison's security apparatus, probably because they suspected she had been in contact with Amy or other potential witnesses to their activities. She needed to make a decision quickly. Submitting to interrogation would almost certainly result in her torture and execution once her true identity was discovered. But resisting openly would blow her cover and potentially compromise any chance of rescuing the trafficking victims who were still being held captive. As the Marine reached across the counter toward her arm, intending to physically compel her compliance with his demands, Maria felt every muscle in her body tense for action. 3 months of suppressing her natural reflexes and abilities had brought her to this moment of truth. The confrontation that would define the rest of her mission was about to begin, though neither she nor Morrison's associate fully understood what they were about to unleash. The moment the Marine's hand made contact with Maria's arm, every alarm bell in her training screamed that her cover was blown. His grip was firm and deliberate, the kind of control hold used by someone preparing to physically compel compliance. After 3 months of careful infiltration, Maria Santos found herself face-to-face with the choice she had hoped to avoid: submit to capture and likely execution, or defend herself and expose her true identity. "Let's take a walk," the Marine said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "We need to discuss your employment history." Maria felt her SEAL training take over as her mind automatically assessed tactical options. The restaurant was nearly empty, with only two elderly customers remaining in the far corner booth. The cook was in the back kitchen, probably unaware of what was happening in the dining area. If this escalated to violence, civilian casualties would be minimal. But engaging in combat would destroy 3 months of undercover work and potentially compromise the rescue operation for 20 trafficking victims. Even if she could neutralize Morrison's associate without killing him, his disappearance would alert the entire network that they had been infiltrated by federal agents. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Maria said, attempting to maintain her cover even as she calculated distances and angles for potential counterattacks. "I just work here. I don't know anything about employment history except my own." The Marine's smile was cold and predatory. "See, that's where you're wrong, sweetheart. We know exactly who you are and who you work for. The only question now is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or if we're going to have to persuade you." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized the full implications of his words. Morrison's organization hadn't just detected surveillance. They had specifically identified her as a federal agent. Someone with access to classified information had provided them with details about her mission and cover identity. The mole inside the operation wasn't just providing general warnings about law enforcement interest. They were actively betraying specific agents and operations to the trafficking network. Maria's handler, Commander Chun, and possibly other personnel involved in the investigation were all potentially compromised. "I really don't know what you're talking about," Maria insisted, but she could see in the Marine's eyes that her protests were futile. He had clearly been briefed on her real identity and was simply going through the motions of giving her a chance to surrender peacefully. "Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Navy SEALs," the Marine said quietly, his voice barely audible to anyone more than a few feet away. 3 years active duty, specialized in maritime counterterrorism operations. Currently assigned to naval intelligence for deep cover infiltration of suspected trafficking networks operating through Camp Pendleton. Hearing her real name and service records spoken aloud in Rosie's diner felt surreal, like watching someone else's life being exposed. Maria realized that Morrison's organization knew more about her background than some of her own family members. The level of intelligence they had access to suggested connections within the highest levels of military and government hierarchy. "That's a very interesting story," Maria replied, still maintaining the pretense of her cover identity, even though both of them knew it was pointless. "But, like I said, I think you have me confused with someone else." The Marine's grip on her arm tightened, and Maria could feel him beginning to apply pressure designed to compel movement toward the restaurant's rear exit. In a few seconds, he would attempt to force her into the alley where additional personnel were undoubtedly waiting to transport her to an interrogation facility. Once they had her isolated, Morrison's organization would extract every detail of the federal investigation before disposing of her permanently. They would learn about surveillance protocols, communication methods, and the identities of other personnel involved in the operation. Her capture would not only end her own life, but potentially compromise dozens of other agents and operations. Maria made her decision in the split second before the Marine began pulling her toward the door. 3 months of suppressing her true nature ended in an explosion of precisely controlled violence that demonstrated exactly why Navy SEALs were considered among the most dangerous individuals on the planet. She twisted her arm in a specific pattern that broke the Marine's grip while simultaneously striking a pressure point that temporarily paralyzed his right hand. The movement was so fast and fluid that the other customers in the restaurant didn't even notice anything had happened. To them, it would have appeared that the man had simply let go of her arm and stepped backward. But the Marine knew exactly what had just happened. His eyes widened with surprise and pain as feelings slowly returned to his hand. He had expected to be dealing with a frightened undercover agent who might struggle, but lacked the training to effectively resist. Instead, he had just experienced a defensive technique that only someone with advanced military combat training could have executed so precisely. "Now that was interesting," he said, his voice filled with new respect and wariness. "I guess the intelligence reports were accurate after all." Maria said nothing, maintaining her position behind the counter while calculating her next moves. The Marine now knew for certain that she was a trained operative, But he also understood that attacking her directly in a public location would create complications for his organization. They needed her alive for interrogation, which gave her a tactical advantage in the current situation. Here's how this is going to work. The Marine continued, pulling out his cell phone. I'm going to make a call to some friends who would very much like to meet you. You can come with us voluntarily, and maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement, or we can do this the hard way, and you'll end up in the same place, but significantly more uncomfortable. Maria watched him dial a number, knowing that backup units were probably already converging on Rosie's diner. Morrison's organization would have planned for the possibility of her resisting capture, which meant she was likely outnumbered and surrounded by personnel who knew exactly what they were dealing with. But she also had advantages that Morrison's people probably didn't fully appreciate. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, operating alone behind enemy lines with no support and minimal equipment. More importantly, she had spent 3 months studying the terrain around the restaurant and identifying potential escape routes and defensive positions. The Marine finished his call and returned his attention to Maria, his expression confident and predatory. My friends will be here in about 10 minutes. Until then, you and I are going to have a nice, quiet conversation about your mission parameters and operational objectives. I told you. I think you had me confused with someone else, Maria replied, but her voice had changed subtly. Gone was the tired, submissive tone of a minimum wage worker. In its place was the calm, controlled authority of someone accustomed to life and death situations. The Marine noticed the change immediately, his smile widening with appreciation. There she is, Staff Sergeant Santos, finally dropping the act. I have to admit, you had me fooled for a while. If it wasn't for our friend in naval intelligence, we might never have figured out who you really were. This confirmed Maria's worst fears about the scope of the security breach. The mole wasn't just someone with access to general operational information. They were highly placed within the naval intelligence hierarchy, possibly someone with direct knowledge of her mission parameters and personal background. What do you want from me? Maria asked, abandoning the pretense that was no longer serving any purpose. Information, the Marine replied simply. Names, procedures, communication protocols, operational timelines. Everything you know about federal law enforcement interest in our business operations. Maria understood that Morrison's organization was facing exposure of their entire trafficking network and needed to assess the scope of the threat they were facing. Her interrogation would provide them with the intelligence needed to identify and neutralize other federal agents while relocating their operations to safer territory. And if I refused to cooperate? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The Marine's expression grew cold. Then, you'll find out exactly how creative we can get when it comes to persuasion techniques. But either way, you're going to tell us what we want to know. The only question is how much you're going to suffer in the process. Maria realized that she was rapidly approaching the point where submission meant certain death, and resistance meant blowing her cover, but potentially surviving to continue the mission. The calculus was brutal, but clear. Her life was worth more than maintaining the pretense of being someone she wasn't. The sound of vehicles pulling into the restaurant's parking lot confirmed that Morrison's backup units had arrived ahead of schedule. Through the front window, Maria could see at least 2 SUVs with tinted windows, the kind of vehicles commonly used by military contractors and private security firms. Looks like the cavalry arrived early, the Marine observed with satisfaction. Time to go, Staff Sergeant. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. But Maria had already made her decision. 3 months of playing the role of a vulnerable minimum wage worker ended as she embraced her true identity for the first time since beginning the mission. When Morrison's reinforcements entered Rosie's diner, they would discover that they weren't dealing with a frightened undercover agent. They were about to face a Navy SEAL who had been trained to fight and win against overwhelming odds. The confrontation that would define the rest of her life was about to begin, and Maria Santos was finally ready to show Morrison's organization exactly what they had been foolish enough to threaten. The front door of Rosie's diner opened with a chime that sounded like a death knell. Buck Morrison entered first, followed by 3 men who moved with the disciplined coordination of a military unit. Maria recognized 2 of them as Marines she had observed during her months of surveillance, but The third was someone new, a man whose bearing and equipment suggested special operations background. Morrison's eyes locked onto Maria immediately, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and predatory anticipation. He had clearly been looking forward to this confrontation ever since discovering her true identity. For him, this wasn't just about operational security, it was personal revenge against someone who had been watching him for months. Well, Morrison said as he approached the counter, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. If it isn't our friendly neighborhood waitress, or should I say, Staff Sergeant Santos? The elderly couple in the corner booth looked up nervously at the change in atmosphere. Maria made a quick decision that would save their lives while eliminating potential hostages from the tactical situation. "Excuse me, folks," she called to the elderly customers, dropping her fake accent and speaking in her natural voice for the first time in months. "I need you to leave right now. Use the front door and don't look back." The authority in her tone was unmistakable. The couple gathered their belongings quickly and headed for the exit, sensing that something dangerous was about to happen. Morrison made no move to stop them, confirming Maria's assessment that civilians weren't part of his immediate tactical concerns. Once the restaurant was clear of innocents, Morrison's team spread out to cover all exits and create overlapping fields of fire. Their movement was professional and coordinated, suggesting significant combat experience and tactical training. Maria realized she was facing 4 highly skilled opponents in an environment that offered limited cover and no escape routes. "You know," Morrison continued conversationally, "I have to admire the commitment. 3 months of slinging hash and cleaning tables, watching us conduct business while pretending to be some pathetic minimum wage worker. That takes real dedication to the mission." Maria remained behind the counter, using the barrier to maintain some separation while evaluating her options. The kitchen behind her offered potential weapons and cover, but it also represented a dead end that could become a trap. Her best chance was to thin their numbers before they could coordinate an effective assault. "What gave me away?" Maria asked, genuinely curious about the security breach that had compromised her mission. Morrison smiled with genuine pleasure. "Your handler, Commander Chun, was very helpful once we explained the situation to her. Amazing what people will tell you when properly motivated." The news hit Maria like a physical blow. Sarah Chun had been her lifeline throughout the undercover mission, the one person she trusted completely within the naval intelligence hierarchy. If Chun had been captured and compromised, it meant the entire operation was blown and Maria was completely on her own. "Where is she?" Maria demanded, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Safe and sound," Morrison replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "At least as safe as anyone can be when they're no longer useful to their organization. But don't worry about Commander Chin right now. You should be more concerned about your own situation." One of Morrison's men moved closer to the counter, attempting to flank Maria's position while Morrison kept her attention focused forward. She tracked his movement with peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact with Morrison, demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness that only came from extensive combat training. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison continued. "You're going to come with us to a location where we can have a detailed discussion about federal law enforcement operations targeting our business interests. You're going to provide us with names, locations, communication protocols, and operational timelines. In exchange, we'll make your eventual death relatively quick and painless." The man attempting to flank her position made his move, reaching across the counter to grab her arm. Maria's response was instantaneous and devastating. She caught his wrist and used his own momentum to slam his face into the counter with enough force to break his nose and render him unconscious. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Morrison's expression shifted from confident arrogance to wary respect as he witnessed the speed and precision of her counterattack. He had clearly expected to be dealing with a standard intelligence operative who might resist, but lacked the combat skills to pose a serious threat. Instead, he was facing someone whose capabilities matched or exceeded his own. "Step aside, bitch," Morrison snarled, drawing a pistol from beneath his jacket. You just made this a lot more complicated than it needed to be. The insult was the final straw that broke 3 months of carefully maintained restraint. Maria Santos had endured countless indignities and humiliations while maintaining her cover identity, but hearing those words spoken by a man who trafficked innocent women triggered something primal and unforgiving in her nature. "You know what?" Maria said, her voice deadly calm as she moved out from behind the counter. "I'm really tired of pretending to be someone I'm not." What happened next would be dissected and analyzed by military instructors for years to come as a perfect example of how superior training and mental preparation could overcome numerical disadvantage and tactical positioning. Maria's transformation was immediate and complete. Gone was any trace of the submissive, tired waitress who had served coffee and endured casual disrespect for 3 months. In her place stood a Navy SEAL operating at the peak of her lethal capabilities, every movement precise and economical as she engaged multiple opponents in close-quarters combat. She moved toward Morrison's pistol rather than away from it, using aggressive forward momentum to disrupt his ability to acquire a clear shot. Her left hand deflected his gun arm, while her right delivered a devastating strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over and caused him to drop his weapon. The second gunman tried to get a clear shot while avoiding hitting Morrison, but Maria used her first opponent as a shield while delivering a knee strike that ended his participation in the fight. The third man, the one with special operations background, proved more challenging as he attempted to coordinate with Morrison in a 2-person assault. But Maria's SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. She flowed between her opponents like water, using their numbers against them by forcing them to interfere with each other's attacks. Every strike she delivered was calculated to maximize damage while positioning her for the next engagement. Morrison recovered from her initial attack and tried to tackle her, using his size and strength advantage to overwhelm her with brute force. But Maria's training emphasized using an opponent's aggression against them, and she redirected his charge into the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The fight was brutal and brief, lasting less than 90 seconds from beginning to end. When it was over, Morrison lay unconscious beside 3 of his associates, all of them neutralized by precisely applied force that left them alive, but thoroughly incapacitated. Maria stood over Morrison's prone form, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. The restaurant was destroyed, with broken furniture and blood on the walls providing evidence of the violence that had just occurred. But she was alive and free, with 4 high-value prisoners who could provide intelligence about the trafficking network's operations. She quickly searched Morrison's pockets and found his cell phone, along with a list of contacts that included several names she recognized from her surveillance work. More importantly, she discovered a text message thread that included references to the warehouse facility where the trafficking victims were being held. Using Morrison's phone, Maria sent a message to his associates claiming that the package has been secured and requesting immediate transport to the primary facility. The response came back within minutes, providing detailed directions to a location that matched Amy's description of where she had been held captive. Maria realized that Morrison's capture of her had been intended as the final step before relocating the entire trafficking operation to avoid federal law enforcement. His associates were expecting him to bring her to their facility for interrogation, which meant they would be unprepared for what was actually coming their way. She quickly contacted her backup handler using Morrison's secure communication device, providing a brief situation report and the location intelligence she had extracted from his phone. Naval intelligence would coordinate with local law enforcement to surround the facility while Maria provided real-time intelligence from inside the trafficking network. 20 minutes later, Maria was driving Morrison's SUV toward the warehouse facility, her prisoners secured in the back with zip ties she had found in their equipment bags. She had changed out of her waitress uniform into tactical gear taken from Morrison's vehicle, transforming once again from her cover identity into her true nature as a special operations warrior. The rescue operation that followed would be studied as a textbook example of how intelligence preparation and tactical execution could combine to achieve mission success against overwhelming odds. Federal agents surrounded the facility while Maria provided overwatch and real-time intelligence about the layout and personnel inside. When the assault began, 19 trafficking victims were recovered alive and unharmed, including Amy, who had provided the initial intelligence that made their rescue possible. The entire trafficking network was rolled up in coordinated raids across 3 states, with Morrison's evidence leading to arrests that reached into the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Commander Chan was found alive, but seriously injured at a secondary facility, her capture and interrogation having provided Morrison's organization with the intelligence they used to identify Maria's cover identity. Her survival was due largely to Maria's quick action in neutralizing the threat before her handler could be executed as a security liability. The aftermath of the operation brought recognition and controversy in equal measure. Maria received the Navy Cross for her actions, but she also faced criticism from some quarters for breaking cover and engaging in unauthorized combat operations. The debate about her choices would continue for years within military and intelligence communities. But for Maria Santos, the only judgment that mattered came from the 19 women whose lives had been saved by her willingness to drop the pretense and embrace her true nature when it counted most. Buck Morrison had made the fatal mistake of underestimating someone he saw as weak and helpless, never realizing that appearances could be the deadliest deception of all. 6 months later, Maria returned to active duty with her SEAL team, her undercover days behind her, and her reputation as one of the military's most effective special operations warriors firmly established. She had learned that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in maintaining a false identity, but in having the strength to be exactly who you were trained to be when innocent lives hung in the balance. Morrison and his associates received sentences ranging from 25 years to life in federal prison. Their trafficking network permanently dismantled, and its victims finally safe from the predators who had stolen their freedom. The mole within naval intelligence was identified and prosecuted, ensuring that future operations would be protected from internal betrayal. The mission was complete, the victims were safe, and justice had been served. For Maria Santos, it was exactly the outcome she had sworn an oath to achieve, regardless of the personal cost or professional risk involved. In the end, that oath had proven stronger than any cover identity she could have maintained.